Um, Good evening, everyone. Perfect. So I'd like to first say that I'm all excited to be here. It's honestly an honor for us to be invited, and I think this is the biggest crowd that we've ever had, so thank you all for showing up here. I'd like to thank everyone who made this possible. Dr. Hester, thank you so much for having us. All of you guys who are here to participate, and of course I'll not forget to thank our Jamaican friends over here, as well as the UWG debate team. So to be honest, having the Jamaican team for us for the past 2 days has just been exciting and fun, especially last night. So with that said, let's begin the debate. So tonight's debate, Wakanda forever. Or never. So I would like to say that we as the Rwandan team today will defend the unpopular argument that Wakanda, never. We're defending that tonight. So this debate, as you probably have already understood, is not a debate about the movie Black Panther, right? But it's rather a debate or discussion about intercultural appropriation or solidarity. So as the Africans on this panel, we will defend the position that African Americans or the Africans in the diaspora should stop appropriating the African culture. So, and by the way, we have 54 countries in Africa, so please do not ask us if we speak Afrikaans, or do not ask us who is the president of Africa. We have 54 countries. So even though this is a discussion about intercultural appropriation, we cannot have this discussion without a discussion about the impact of slavery, colonialism, and the white imperialism has had not only on the Africans on the continent, but also the black people all over the world. Because we believe that without slavery, we would not need to have this discussion. Because without slavery, we would not need to have this discussion. There would be no need to have a discussion because we would not have a category of people who are African Americans or Jamaicans from African descent. So slavery separated us physically, colonialism made us demonize those from the same ancestry, but then imperialism has done all to separate us against one another. So it is important to acknowledge that there is a great divide between blacks in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in America. So allow me to go back a little bit in history to analyze some of the reasons as to why tensions between Africans and African Americans exist today. So in an article that she wrote, Latoya Dixon argues that the tension between these two groups started in the early 1980s, when the media, as usual, portrayed negatively Africa, with the images such as poverty, starvation, death, and calamities. So this made some Afro-Americans feel ashamed to identify themselves as part of the continent because, again, nobody wants to be seen as the one who comes from the dark continent. This created an outrage in Africans who thought Afro-Americans simply do not deserve the African culture with them, however much they might be linked to it. So the debate of cultural appropriation, the one that we're having, has been a very popular debate, especially after the release of the great Black Panther, which is claimed by many to be the only all-black movie. Again, this probably shows that none of them watched Nigerian movies. So this movie created excitement as people waited impatiently for it. So those of you who know, you know what I mean. So, however, some Africans were bored by the fact that those who are not Africans showed up to the movie in African clothing. In fact, somebody actually tweeted that the Black Panther was exclusively created to honor the African culture. And so for that, he feels disgraced by seeing those who are not Africans wear such clothes simply because they do not know the meaning. So with that said, I'll just go on and discuss the reasons as to why we think cultural appropriation is wrong, or the reasons as to why we simply think it's offensive for us Africans. Now, the first reason as to why we are going to argue all of this is because people do not understand the meaning of the African culture, or they just have a shallow understanding, something that they probably got from whatever, a friend or a newspaper. So a culture is a very important aspect of our lives. So it shapes us into who we are and who we're going to be. Now, I know for a fact that African dresses and scarves, dashikis can be all beautiful with the unique prints that they have. But again, that does not exclude the fact that they have stories behind them. These dresses that everyone finds fancy or pretty have more than just a beautiful design in the eyes of Africans. These dresses represent a story. These dresses represent a journey, a story that we're deeply connected to. Now, the same happens for tribal marks. We find it very offensive when someone wears tribal marks. Tribal marks represent something special for Africans, so therefore, it's simply offensive when someone wears tribal marks without knowing what it is, simply because they find it cool. So culture, again, is a product of people and their environment. The way one dresses or talks depends on where they're from. While the dashikis have so much historical meaning to Africans, it would be inappropriate for an outsider to wear them because, first of all, it tends to give a false security of their knowledge of the culture, in the sense that just because they're wearing a dashiki, they'll think they can be Africans, or they'll think they know everything about Africa. Just because someone can speak a couple of words in many of the African languages, they'll tend to believe they know a lot about Africa. So the truth is, most of those people do not know anything, or if they do, they just have a shallow understanding of what X means and how Y is slightly different. So this kind of mentality does not allow for one to dig deeper in the history of Africa, and actually this makes people, which again results into spreading false information, because just because people have a shallow understanding, they'll just spread whatever they have as an information, again, which is wrong. So we basically think it's a huge undermining and a huge disrespect of people appropriating African culture. Now, the second thing, people only wear African clothes because they think it's trendy. A student in an Afro-American study went to an Afro-Punk festival, and she was surprised by how many people wore African clothes. She did a survey and found out that most people who wore it simply say that there was no actual reason behind that, apart from the fact that it looked trendy or just fancy. So for clothes that have so much meaning for us Africans, we simply find it, again, disrespectful that somebody puts it on and for the sake of it just being trendy. Now, of course, this argument could be made against the intercultural appropriation, but we would like to make the argument that this is also the same for Afro-Americans and Caribbeans from African descendants. So first of all, even though they're black, they're African-Americans, they have been cultured into their specific locations. So Afro-Americans in the 19th century, through the Pan-African movement, and especially through the leadership of Marcus Garvey, tried to reconnect to their continent. The Back to Africa movement, also known as the colonization or the After Slave Act, which is a movement that originated in the United States. So it encouraged, basically this movement encouraged people from an African descendant to return back to their homelands in Africa. But guess what happened? Most of the people, this thing simply failed because most of the people did not want to go back. They did not wish to leave the places they were in. So they did not wish to leave the land that they claimed it colonized them. So most of the free black people did not want to go home to a place from which there were generations moved. America, not Africa, was their home at that time and had little desire to migrate to a strange and forbidding land not their own. So yes, African Americans like the idea of Africa, but the truth, the sad reality, is that they are very divorced from the reality of Africa. Now, the second and last argument that we'll make tonight is that even though people might claim to want to appreciate the African culture, many African Americans will see Africa through the eyes of the Western media, or should I say the white media. They'll consume CNN, BBC, Fox News as their source of knowledge about Africa. So as African Americans' view of Africa, so which simply means that African American view of Africa is not different from a white person's view of Africa. So if it's wrong for a white person to appropriate the African culture, it is equally wrong for an African American to do so, because at the core of the perception of our culture, it is still the same. They still view Africa the same way a white person should views it. So Wakanda forever? No, we believe Wakanda never. Thank you.
Wagwan WG, UWG, sorry. I'm from Jamaica, and I want to tell you guys, thank you for having us today. It's been a pleasure so far, and I hope that you guys actually really enjoy this debate. All right, so we are basically saying on our side of the house that what they were saying is that we don't need to have this conversation. We shouldn't have to have this conversation because of colonialism. But because of colonialism, we're saying that we have to have this conversation. This conversation is absolutely necessary. I would want to begin by opening with a quote. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. What we believe is that cultural appropriation can only exist in the space or event that the idea of a power imbalance actually exists. We say on our side of the house that cultural appropriation is an action taken by a group of power to possess or control aspects or ideas of culture from a less dominant group. It is a sociological concept that expresses the imbalance of power between two cultures, where the adoption of the minority culture may result in the reducible or in an economic extortion of ideas. We are saying that majority groups who have had the opportunity to oppress another group through some form of colonialism to create the power imbalances that exist are the creators of the idea of cultural appropriation, wherein, through their power, have some negative impact on the overall culture of another group, whether economically or socially. Members of diasporic Africa are victims of colonialism. They struggle with power imbalances. African societies have also been affected by colonialism. And like diasporic Africans, they continue to suffer with similar negative sociological and economic effects. As such, we believe that they have no basis on which to be culpable of cultural appropriation. So people might argue that this idea is false, but we believe that it isn't false, and I'll be showing you examples of why we believe that this isn't false. We realize that this idea or perspective is created or facilitated by the media, where different things in different societies, like the American society, like the Caribbean societies, are oftentimes glorified by the media, where the Afropunk festivals and so forth are glorified. And compared to what happens, the realities of Africa, the negative realities are glorified in the media. So what we see is that people believe that this is what is existing in the Caribbean and this is what is existing in the United States versus the negatives that actually are portrayed on the media to exist in Africa. So what we're saying is that people form this perspective that shows that there's an existence of a power imbalance, but we don't believe that this is so. We don't believe that this is so because diasporic Africans actually go through similar negative effects, similar experiences as a result of colonialism. Diasporic Africans in the Caribbean have been forced to dilute their cultures because of ideas of vulgarity versus ideas of purity. In the era of slavery, the Africans who came to the Caribbean were forced to denounce their parts of their cultures. If they were not, they would be severely punished or killed. The parts of the culture that remained were the few practices that they could actually manage to hide. The culture that was forced upon them over time was adopted and fused with their existing African traditions, resulting in the formation of a mongrel culture. The Caribbean got saturated with Chinese and Indians later down through indentureship, and the culture got even more diversified. Because of this situational diversification, the perceived African culture in the Caribbean became even more mongrel. What we see happening here is not necessarily cultural appropriation, but the forced consequences of an imbalance in power. Cultural appropriation only exists after those who change the landscape of the culture tries to extensively take the culture for gain. African Americans have found the need to identify with African traditions because of a different experience than the folk in the Caribbean. Many have been shunned by different fractions of society because of their inherent differences, similarities, or even pure hate. They have undergone a struggle of inequality, a struggle of stereotyping, a struggle that has caused generations of family members to not have the opportunity to go to college, that has caused them to not have access to jobs, that has made many of them see the deaths of many black young men and women. Generations of oppression and generations of struggle. We're seeing that many black people look to their blackness, what little African roots that they can hold on to, and whatever fractured traditions. It could be the way they dress, the way they comb their hairs, celebrate their dead, or even play their music. That little piece of Africanness that they can hold on to. How unfortunate in a world where they cannot claim another's culture because of hate and aggression is denied their opportunity to accept that with which they identify with, that their ancestors have a direct link to. Then what identity should they have? Is it bad to feel the need to reestablish a feeling of familiarity, a feeling of appreciation, a feeling of solidarity, of identification? Is it bad to celebrate that little part of you that they hate for no reason? It should never be wrong for a little girl to celebrate whatever part of Africa she can, in whatever way she can, to deal with her struggle, to deal with her insecurities, to deal with her hope that there is a culture somewhere out there that celebrates Black. Many people in the diaspora sees the culture as a means of self-actualization, or as we would say in Jamaica, smodification, in and of itself, rather than an end of achieving material gain. The next idea that I'm going to be talking about is the idea of a symbiotic relationship. Sorry. So cultural appropriation cannot exist if two entities gain similarly from each other in the name of culture. It only happens when there is some form of imbalance. Currently, many Africans all over the continent listen to house music, performs at many events put on by many members of the diasporic Africa, and have similar dress codes as those outside of Africa. Africans and Afro-Caribbean folk have similar music, and as such, throughout the year, many Africans fly out to the Caribbean for tours and vice versa. There are many collaborations with artists in Jamaica and artists on the continent, artists like Alaine, who sang with Marriage from Africa, Michelle Montano from Trinidad and Tobago, etc. Afropunk Festival sees the invitation of many important African men and women who celebrate Blackness and share with them their ideas of their culture. Accepted really quickly, go ahead.
Do you mind proving to the audience if the imbalance you're talking about is not there?
The thing is, we believe that, all right, we believe that there are variables, there are stimulus that exist within society that can actually cause a possible imbalance. But what we're saying on our side of the house is that the imbalance that exists is not significant. It's not significant so much so that individuals within Africa cannot get a mutual benefit from the fusion of cultures between Africans in the diaspora. Let me get back into my substantive. The Afropunk Festival sees the invitation of many important African men and women who celebrate Blackness and share the ideas of culture. Afropunk Festival gives to Black artists who have been marginalized on mainstream media the opportunity or the chance to perform and gain recognition. We see where Beyonce has used Shire from Somalia in her Lemonade album, where she quotes literature, uses her body work for dramatics and so forth. And even though Beyonce gained a lot, Shire did gain a lot of opportunities. She did gain a lot of things monetarily as well, and we believe that this is actually justified and this is something that we should promote at all levels. Okay, so we are saying, as mentioned, that there are some cases of unequal distributions of success in both sides, but the reality is that different situations have different stimulus and variables, as mentioned before, right? We believe that the disproportionality is not significant, right? The significant principle in this case is that it is the oppressed versus the oppressed, and not the oppressors versus the oppressed. We see the solution of the government side as too strict, one that restricts severing ties between African people on the continent and diaspora communities to rigid boundaries that dilute the potential strength of transcontinental solidarity. Here, we assert that thesis statements unlocks the opportunity for diasporic Africans to challenge cultural practices on the continent that may be harmful. We blame the thesis side for lacking solvency in diasporic Africans desperate to connect with their historical culture. We defend that it is possible for diasporic communities to respect African cultures by representing and adhering to traditions. We also believe that Africa in and of itself is not less guilty of this idea of cultural solidarity. We are seeing that it is not confined within the walls of one country or one community or one continent. Therefore, what we are saying is that in Africa we can see where even individuals have adopted the idea of using Indonesian material and so forth, and adopted it in such a way that they have created some meaning for these cloth, and adopted it in such a way that it has woven itself into the intrinsic society, or into an intrinsic valuable nature within society that people find dear to themselves. We are saying on our side that what we see happening is that we see an appreciation of culture rather than a destructive analysis that was given by the government. Thank you for listening.
What's up? All right. So first, I would really like to thank our visitors from Rwanda and Jamaica for sharing their wisdom with us tonight. The debate began with our East African guests noting how misrepresentations of the continent, even when well-intended out of respect by those of African ancestry, are harmful to those whom respect is supposedly being paid and an obstacle to meaningful intercultural understanding. We agree wholeheartedly. However, like the newly crowned king of the fictional Wakanda, their opposition to cultural appropriation risks becoming dogmatic. The walls built to shield indigenous cultures from exploitative consumption by outsiders also prevent the sharing of wisdom and mutually beneficial partnerships across borders. In response to the Rwandan team, our esteemed Caribbean guests eloquently advocated for Pan-Africanism, a call for solidarity that resonates deeply with many communities of the African diaspora and likely many in the audience tonight. For descendants of the Middle Passage, our longing to reconnect with Africa and reclaim the heritage taken from us by white supremacy makes sense. And yet, much like Killmonger's journey revealed, a fiery passion to reconnect with our roots can burn out of control as the flames of revolutionary zeal obscure from our vision, a truer understanding of the world around us. In contrast, we offer a third way. As Black Americans, we believe our perspectives can complement those of our international visitors while respectfully revealing their limitations. In that sense, we ask the audience to remember Nakia. Nakia serves as the moral and political heart of the film. From the first moment we see her as a spy, Nakia is working not only in the interests of Wakanda, but of the African diaspora as a whole. She is introduced operating undercover as a hostage of human traffickers. Her heroism in saving the other hostages has a double impact. Throughout the film, Nakia's exploits serve as a rejection of T'Challa's refusal to engage in political and martial action on behalf of the Pan-African world. Yet her consideration for the lives of others and willingness to place their needs above her own, and even those of her country, also refute Killmonger's Machiavellian approach. When confronted with a choice between the isolationist tendencies of T'Challa or the hegemonic aspirations of Killmonger, we choose the inclusive compassion of Nakia as our revolutionary ideal. Our argument proceeds in two parts. First, we will identify the limitations of our guest positions. Second, we will articulate an alternative position which embraces the best components of the Rwandan and Jamaican positions while leaving behind their most harmful elements. One flawed concept underlying the previous speeches is the representation of culture as static. The Rwandan team emphasizes protecting African cultures from misappropriation by those who do not properly understand what they claim to appreciate. On the surface, the Jamaican team appears to propose a more dynamic conception of culture, given their push for diaspora communities to connect with our roots and build upon traditional African culture. Yet, this invocation of Pan-Africanism reinforces similarly static understandings of culture that we find problematic. We identified two specific problems. First, we must always be wary when traditional culture is invoked as a standard of judgment. As Dr. Kehinde Andrews, Afro-Caribbean professor of sociology at Birmingham City University, argues, the notion that we can look back to a specific point in time where the true African identity can be found is regressive both in theory and practice. What cultural nationalism does is take a particular view of African history and render it immovable. Distortions of the past by those who hold power in the present have a significant impact of whose history is being privileged. Keep in mind, the lion writes the history, not the lamb. Attempts to understand history are always partially constrained by the context of the contemporary moment. Those in power have a strong bias towards selectively interpreting history to justify the present. As for the present state of the world, Bell Hooks observes the times in which we live are dominated by imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. Mobilization of Black solidarity as a response to global oppression must also reckon with the patriarchal and imperialist aspects of our world. As Dr. Andrews explains, when we consider who it is that is doing the rendering of history, it becomes clear that a narrow, patriarchal, and heteronormative vision of Africa is being created. The cultural blinders generated by heteronormative patriarchy explain why we do not see Bayard Rustin at the March on Washington that he was a key planner for because of his homosexuality. It explains why Rosa Parks, the light-skinned elderly Sunday school teacher and NAACP secretary, becomes the face of the Montgomery bus boycott rather than Claudette Colvin, the darker-skinned teenager with a child out of wedlock. Regressive gender constructs are replicated within supposedly progressive movements. Many of the world's greatest racial justice warriors were intentionally hidden from the public's consciousness because they didn't fit the social norms of their day. Second, the patriarchal hierarchies of revolutionary movements grounded in cultural nationalism displace ideas and individuals that are genuinely revolutionary. As Dr. Andrews states, cultural nationalism is patriarchal and heteronormative at its core. For example, the celebration of Killmonger as a true revolutionary mimics this misplaced emphasis on machismo that we too often conflate with radicalism. Sharonda Brown, UNC Greensboro Diaspora Studies academic and author, explains, it is Nakia who first presents the concept of Wakanda offering aid to others because she recognizes that there are others in need, that so many look past her to glorify Ndjaka also known as Killmonger, as the true revolutionary is reflective of how black women of social justice organizations were and are treated. Too many look past Elaine Brown, Erica Huggins, Kathleen Cleaver, and other black women involved in the Black Panther Party to revere Huey P. Newton, Fred Hampton. Yes?
Do you mind helping the audience to understand exactly, out of the movie, where does that happen in Africa?
What does...
The part of, like, in Wakanda, giving aid to the outside world, where does that happen in Africa? Help the audience to understand.
Well, I'm sorry, could you just like kind of like clarify your question? Do you mean like what, like give an example of what African nation has given aid?
To make it simple for you, like the example of the movie, of what happens in the movie that you've just given, can you help the audience and give a real example that is on ground, an African country that is doing what you say that is happening in the movie?
Well, honestly, yeah, honestly, like that's not really something that I would answer right now just because it's not really relevant to the point. But I'm just gonna continue and then come back later. Okay. Despite the fact that Newton was accused of murdering a 17-year-old sex worker and Cleaver was an admitted sexual predator and rapist, misogynoir was blatant within the organization. This is something black women have to wrestle with even now, and identification with Ndijaka over Nakia is indicative of this continued struggle. Nakia reflects the black women and other non-men on the front lines of liberation work. So what is the alternative to cultural nationalism? Is a more inclusive framework for global black solidarity even possible? If so, it begins with an honest acknowledgement that one person's tradition is too often another person's oppression. In his advocacy for a revolutionary black politics, Dr. Andrews notes, the radical nationalism that lies at the heart of black radicalism cannot be contained in traditions from pre-colonial Africa. In fact, some of those traditions would necessarily need to be transcended. We should conceive of revolution as a verb, dynamic, ongoing, and open to change, rather than a noun, static, inflexible, and unmoving. Deference to traditional culture is why the physical mutilation of female circumcision is allowed to continue. Adherence to traditional culture explains the Trokosi system, in which West African girls are forced into slavery to atone for the sins of their elders, usually the men of family. The movement that will end imperialist white supremacist patriarchy must be inclusive, and that requires we reject cultural practices that create and harm marginalized subpopulations. In her analysis of 1960s racial justice activist Tony Bambara, Dr. Brittany Cooper emphasizes rejection of heteronormativity as a key to black radicalism. Bambara's off-cited essay on the issue of roles faced head-on the question of the black woman's role in the revolution by questioning both the binary definitions of masculine and feminine, and offering up her own structural account of black gender categories. Gender binaries militate against what revolution for self is all about. The whole person, and the usual notion of sexual differentiation in roles is an obstacle to political consciousness. Because the way those terms are generally defined and acted upon in this part of the world, it is a hindrance to full development for a revolutionary. Outlining the alternative, Cooper notes, Bambara thus concluded that black communities would create structures to govern gender based upon racial dictates and political priorities, but those structures could not in any way be predicated on the subordination of femininity vis-a-vis female bodies to masculinity or male bodies. She argued for a new way to articulate and make legible black humanity, not predicated on an investment in binary gender categories or limiting notions of manhood or womanhood, but instead blackhood. Black communities needed entirely new conceptions of gender, ones rooted in primacy of preserving black life in order to move towards liberatory articulations of black identity. This concept of blackhood, rooted in the primacy of preserving black life, may sound familiar to some of you. When Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Apal Tamedi sparked the Black Lives Matter movement in wake of George Zimmerman's acquittal of the murder of Trayvon Martin, they continued a long history of queer women of color, providing the intellectual foundations for radical black politics. And as Dr. Cooper argues, this movement provides a blueprint, make that black print, for an inclusive revolution for racial justice. The largely black female leadership of the movement for Black Lives has the potential to usher in a new era in our thinking about the most effective models of racial leadership. Both Garza and Concolors are queer black women, and they have insisted that the Black Lives Matter model for solidarity move behind the narrow nationalism that can be prevalent within some black communities, which merely call upon black people to love black, live black, and buy black, keeping straight cisgender black men in the front of our movement, while our sisters, queer, trans, and disabled folks take up roles in the background or not at all. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and black lives among the gender spectrum.
Thank you very much. I think this is one of the best debates that I've ever had in my life because it talks about something that everyone in the house understands, but we just try to ignore sometimes. But I'm not going to argue saying that African Americans or any other person should not connect with their people. But I'm just going to argue showing, is the right way to connect with your people just wearing what you think represents their culture? Is the right way to connect with people to just paint your face to show that you're from that culture? It goes beyond that. The Jamaican team has argued saying that culture is a simple element that helps people to connect with their roots. But I want to explain something. The best way to connect with a culture is not just wearing what people wear in that culture. The best way to connect with a culture is starting from scratch. Understand the struggle that your ancestors went through. Understand the struggle of the country you say that where you came from. Because the point is, when you wear just a dashiki because you want to go for a movie, I find that as a sign of pretense because you do not understand the mindset. How did it come that Africans now wear dashikis? How did it come that we have different cultures in Africa? It's not about wearing, it's about understanding the history of the countries where you come from. Today, if African Americans want to celebrate people who helped Black Americans, they'll talk about Martin Luther King, they'll talk about Malcolm X, but they'll not talk about people who helped their brothers and sisters not to go through the slavery again. They never talk about Kwame Nkrumah, they never talk about Nelson Mandela, they never talk about African heroes, they only talk about African American heroes. And I find that's what my first speaker said, that African Americans, even if you say that you want to connect with your roots, sometimes you're pretending because you're not really doing the efforts that it takes for you to connect with the roots. Because I don't understand the fact of connecting to the roots that you do not understand. You're just eating the fruits of the fight that Africans went through. Now, I'll get all the point of information after. You can have your seat. I'll get it after. All right, so now, they talked about solidarity. They talked about solidarity. It's fine to think like that, but not always what you think about and the plan you give to achieve what you're saying is right. Because I think if we are to go back and check the statistics, you will realize that how much money is made by Black Americans who bring up all these events that are so intended to promote the African culture. How much money do they make? I know we will all agree, a lot. But now the question comes back, how much money do they invest back to their roots? None. You cannot pretend making a lot of money from the African culture and you do not go back and invest to help the people in your country, in your roots to develop again. Now African countries, 80% of African countries are considered to be the third world countries. Do you know what that means? It means that most of African people survive below $1 per day. Now you're making money, not investing to help your people, and you claim that you're connecting to your roots. How are you connecting if people in your roots are suffering? You're eating the fruits. I'll say that over and over again. Now, when we talk of solidarity, I think it's not about wearing. I'll come back to that because I think that's the main point, that we need to make sure that at least people in the house, because they're the people again who are going to come back and help Africa, it's not that you have to connect by just wearing. Because when you're wearing, you're just buying products that some people here made and they're going to eat the money and just chill there and Africa suffer. Because I think, again, they talked about the point of media being the main thing that they consume that shows them Africa. Each African country has a television, but if I'm to ask African, black American people who are in this house, how many TVs from America, from Africa do you watch, or how many TVs from Jamaica do you watch? People are going to just be like, do you guys also watch Beat? And I'm like, but it's not African thing, it's a black American thing. But
that point.
All right, I'll take. Yep.
So you are calling for aid from the rest of diasporic Africa, but what about Africa itself? Is Africa united yet? Because for diasporic Africa to play their role, Africa as a continent must play its role first.
All right, so that's a point. That's a point that works everywhere. We can never have a perfect world where everyone is united. Only if we are dreaming, because we can never have a world where there are no conflicts or where there are no divisionism in people. Because even within the black Americans that we're talking about, within the Jamaicans that we're talking about, if you prove that you guys are having perfect relationships, then I can't marry a Jamaican. Now, they talked about the point that what they're seeing here is oppressed versus oppressed. The question is, if we are oppressed, yes, we are oppressed, African people, black Americans were oppressed, but is the struggle the same? Is the struggle of those two groups the same? Not that both groups being oppressed means that we all go through the same thing. Because if you still go back, in Rwanda 1994, we suffered the genocide and black Americans existed. No one said that, hey, there is struggle in our country. People are dying. There is struggle in our roots. No one came up. But sometimes I feel sorry that it happens, but when someone is killed in America, we sometimes tweet about it because we feel like, yeah, our people there are hurting. But when you see the reaction that you have on what happens in our country is less. So I don't think we can blame Africans for African Americans or for any other person not understanding the culture. It needs both sides to act, but it needs African Americans who now understand that their roots need, that they have a root in Africa to stand up and work and take the first step. So, my conclusion is, if the team is saying that we need solidarity, we need Pan-Africanism, we should start by learning the history. If we are talking about embracing the roots, we should start with the history. If we are talking about being people that really love Africa, we should prove it not by pretending to paint our faces, not by pretending to just wear different things from Africa because we think we are connecting with Africa. Let's prove it by actions, not just buying things that are going to help people who are not suffering like Africans are suffering. My last point is, I love the way the third team tried to help the House to understand the movie, though it wasn't the main point. But then I just want, the movie sometimes, even when African people, when we watch it, we're like, wow, which country is that in Africa? Because it's all about the movie, the content that is going to make a lot of money. Guys, go beyond Hollywood because Nigeria makes movies, Ghana makes movies, Rwanda, we make movies. Understand your roots from your roots, not to understand your roots from people who are blinding you not to see exactly your roots and your history. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so let me just start by saying that what was said by the member from Rwanda doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because the member said to us that it is impossible for the world to be united, but yet still he stands here speaking about unity. You need to come straight. Now, let me just say this and say this clear, that the struggle that Africans are facing is the same struggle black men and black women face in America. The same effect. The same effect that comes from the apartheid is the same daily struggles that they face here. All right? But let me just get into my substantive. Now, it is important for us to understand the importance of colonialism or slavery because, of course, we were taken away from our roots. And we're not just here talking about connection, we're talking about the whole idea of Pan-Africanism. And I'm sure my brother over there doesn't understand Pan-Africanism because the tenets of Pan-Africanism is really racial pride and racial identity. So within Pan-Africanism, the connection does not only come, but it comes with understanding and knowledge. So my brother, you are wrong. There was a great emphasis placed on the media with a great assumption. But let me just say that you are right, my sister. The media is indeed dividing us, and that is why we are here today talking about the whole idea of cultural appropriation. The truth about it is that the media is controlled by white supremacy who continues to divide black people over and over again. And so, my sister, you are right with us that there is no form of power imbalance. The only thing that is causing the division is really the media. The whole entire idea behind the dashiki has mentioned about meaning behind it. Let me tell you something, black brothers and sisters. To wear a dashiki, you don't have to have a definite definition from it or its roots. You are a black man, you understand your struggles. You wear your dashiki and give your black meaning to it and your blackness to it. But let me also share a story. Because it is funny, that I'm here wearing a dashiki and he's there in a British man jacket. How awesome is that? So if I am... So the sad reality... The sad reality is that if I am appropriating, he's also appropriating. All right? And he's also right about the story behind the dashiki because I noticed how we own up the dashiki, but let me just give you a little information. The dashiki did not came from Africa. It came from Indonesia through a Dutch exchange. So dashiki does not belong to Africa. It belongs to you because of a Dutch exchange. So it did not originate in your country, my brother. Don't get it wrong. It is important. It is very important for us to understand, as we Jamaican would say, war for you can't be unfair, right? And so, let me just say this as well. Let me also mention as well that no culture is unique. No culture is unique, right? So there's nothing that is in Africa that belongs to Africa alone. Nothing. No culture is unique and no culture is origin. Through apartheid colonialism, that is why culture comes about. Culture is really a mixture, and like Jamaican motto, out of many one people. Not accepted. No. What is important? What is important, You see, I understand that the brother continued to emphasize about Nigerian movie and all sort of movie. But let us be smart about this now. I mentioned earlier that the media is controlled by white supremacy. So how is it that you're going to expect Nigerian movie to show on American TV when it's not the black man who controls the media? And that is why the black man cannot mention Nigerian actor. They can only see what they've been fed. That is important for you to understand. Now, my sister here from from West Georgia mentioned the idea about the carefulness in Pan-Africanism. But I also want to say unto you, sister, that anything outside of people being united as a race cannot be an idea that stems from Pan-Africanism. It is the idea of post-traumatic slave syndrome. So whenever there is the idea that comes that black people have to be careful how they celebrate Pan-Africanism, that is wrong, my sister. Pan-Africanism about unity, black unity, nothing else, nothing more. All right? So be careful about that. Here I am. So let me continue. So it is important for us to understand the idea of cultural appreciation. What we're doing is not appropriating, we're appreciating our culture. That is what we're doing. We are reconnecting. Go ahead, my sister.
So, just kind of recalling on the unity within Pan-Africanism, kind of recalling what I explained in the constructive, where would you say the unity is in a binary that uplifts men and masculinity and undermines women and femininity?
That is not Pan-Africanism. That is something else. That is not Pan-Africanism, sister. Marcus Garvey and Osagi for Kwame Nkrumah speak what is Pan-Africanism. So when we're finished, you're going to take a read. I dare you. Now, let me just wrap up my debate. And it was important for me to say this, that I am not African, my brother there in the dashiki, because I was born in Africa. Rather, you are not African because you were born in Africa. You are African because Africa was born within you. And so that is important. Now, how unfortunate it would be to remove a piece of ourselves, right? A piece of ourselves and our generations of experience and the things of harmless, intrinsic value in the name of culture. If it's a situation where we cannot identify ourselves with Africans, we surely can't identify ourselves with the whites. So what are we going to do? We have to find a group, my brother, that suits our color, a group that faces the same struggles as us. And that is why we're saying it is not cultural appropriation. It is really cultural appreciation. I thank you. God bless you.
So as we expected, our visitors have brought us great wisdom here. And I want to say a couple of things about what we agree with. We agree with our Rwandan visitors that appropriation of African culture is a problem across the diaspora. So wearing a dashiki and saying that buying black does not make you woke or does not make you African, it makes you foolish. So we agree that as African Americans, we have been cultured in this geographic region, the United States, because of the transatlantic slave trade. So we simply cannot go back to our African roots because we don't know them. I mean, for example, most of us in this room probably didn't know that there were 52, 54 countries in Africa today. I'm seeing a lot of shaking hands, I know. So on to the Jamaicans. So the experiences of the different diasporic cultures are similar. That's what they said in their constructive speech, and we agree. We were stripped of our identity. In the case of Africa, they created borders without regards to the ethnic divisions amongst the different tribes and peoples. However, this debate has been expanded away from cultural appropriation into solidarity. Considering the fact that we have Rwandans and Jamaicans in the room, we feel as though this topic is very important. So one of the problems of previous attempts to unify the diaspora has been the marginalization of those who have identified or has been perceived as a deviation from the standard norm. So examples include Bayard Rustin, a civil rights activist who was the orchestrator of the journey of reconciliation that inspired the Freedom Riders. So most of you probably haven't heard of him because not only did he influence and associate with socialists and communists, but he was also openly gay. Considering this is the 1950s, that is pretty significant. And also Black Lives Matter was started by 3 transgender black women and operates as a decentralized movement made up of thousands, if not millions, of activists working towards a collective goal independently. So when I said earlier in my the answer to the question, I believe, towards Asher about blackness, blackness is the glue that binds movements as Pan-Africanism or Black Lives Matter. So our interpretation of blackness is not bound by culture or ties to a location, but simply a fluid idea of solidarity in response to political oppression. So its fluidity allows us to define, allows blackness to be defined by common struggle. So our argument can be analogous to Nakia from Black Panther, as my partner stated. So she's open to offering aid and help to diaspora and still maintain the culture of Wakanda. So not only is she on the front lines as a spy, but she wields significant power in a kingdom that is literally designed and built around a man. So now I want to address some of the arguments our visitors have made. One of those in particular, I believe, was the last speech that dealt with solidarity, the speech before that with Mecca. Solidarity built around retracing roots and learning history. So as our Jamaican visitors have repeatedly said that the media is controlled by white people, I believe. And so we can't possibly learn our history from the media. And so I believe it's up to Africans themselves to step up and teach us, African Americans and diaspora communities, about how to retrace our roots. And so also going on this we're not necessarily picking or chastising our guests for having a backwards or quote unquote backwards thinking around cultural appropriation. I think a lot of the questions seem to suggest, but rather that thinking and looking back to the past replicates the same structures that we are fighting against. And so notice that how we've been bickering over appropriation for the last hour when people all around the world are suffering and look like us. So this is why we have shifted the debate from cultural appropriation to solidarity. Sorry, I hate using the laptop here. So we have enjoyed our Rwandan and Jamaican visitors' insights, perspectives, and arguments. We have likened our Rwandan visitors' position to T'Challa. Attempts to appreciate African culture end up becoming appropriation. So we liken the position of our J visitors to the Killmonger from Black Panther, of course, a Pan-African movement that unifies the diaspora by reconnecting our roots. We agree that an attempt should be made to unify the diaspora, however, we disagree on how. So attempts in the past to extrapolate culture from a time that none of us can remember is counterintuitive, whereas my partner stated earlier, our perception of history is determined by the conquerors and not the conquered. Therefore, we inevitably recreate or replicate the same structure that we are fighting against. This is our main critique of Pan-Africanism, and Pan-Africanism in and of itself is transnational, which is something that blackness is, but it's not inclusive. So we agree with our Rwandan visitors when we say that we need to get our own culture and stop appropriating theirs. However, we disagree on why. And if we disagree on why because appropriating that culture just replicates the same structures over and over again. So I want to actually thank the audience for listening about, I think, an hour's worth of speech on a homecoming week. So I know there's a bunch of stuff you guys probably could be doing right now. And so I just want to leave you guys with a quote. So in Black Panther, T'Challa was grappling with how to address his father's mistake. If you haven't seen the movie, I don't want to, well, I can spoil it, I guess. But his father killed his brother. There's a reason why. And also the dismal situation amongst the diaspora. So he's seeking advice from Nakia. So Nakia tells him, you can't let your father's mistakes define who you are. You get to choose what kind of king you are going to be. So as young black people, we must decide how to unify and unite the diaspora without falling prey to the mistakes from our past. So we must be inclusive yet radical. So remember, Wakanda forever. Thank you.